The entire fragile peace at Windsor essentially crumbled over a single, highly charged word: grandmother. 9-year-old Princess Charlotte sat down at what was supposed to be a completely ordinary, relaxed private family lunch, and within minutes she delivered a sentence so calmly devastating that absolutely nobody in the room knew how to adequately recover. King Charles was present, along with William, Catherine, and all three of their children, creating an intimate but inherently pressurized environment. Camilla had been keeping the conversation deliberately light and breezy, acutely aware that recent unspoken tensions had made even private royal meals feel incredibly sensitive, and for a while everyone successfully played their assigned parts. Then Camilla casually, and perhaps absent-mindedly, described herself as belonging to the children's grandparent generation, prompting Charlotte to look up from her plate and answer with an absolutely surgical, unshakable calm. She stated clearly that she already knew exactly who her grandmothers were, and that she would not call Camilla her grandmother. The room did not erupt into chaos or shouting. Instead, it went terrifyingly, suffocatingly quiet. That specific detail is what makes the incident so striking. Nobody gasped dramatically, nobody scrambled desperately to fix the awkwardness, and nobody jumped in with a clumsy distraction to change the subject. The heavy silence simply stretched out, and in that agonizing pause, everyone at the table understood exactly what had just happened. Charlotte had made a deliberate, conscious choice, and Camilla felt the full weight of it. Charles heard his granddaughter's declaration, and his immediate instinct, acting as both a protective grandfather and the reigning monarch, was to ask her why she had said it, expecting an embarrassed apology or a childish explanation that could be easily smoothed over. Instead, Charlotte calmly answered that some family names have to be earned by how people make you feel, an incredibly profound statement for a 9-year-old that was clearly not coached, rehearsed, or delivered as a tantrum. She then politely asked to leave the table. Catherine nodded her silent approval, and the loud scrape of Charlotte's chair against the floor became the defining sound of the afternoon. Camilla remained entirely frozen in her seat, while Charles stared at William, suddenly and acutely aware that absolutely no royal decree or palace command could undo the emotional reality of what had just occurred. William wasn't angry at his daughter. He watched her carefully rather than immediately correcting her, signaling that he understood the deeper roots of this confrontation. When Catherine followed Charlotte out into the quiet corridor, the real hidden story finally started coming out, revealing that this was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of weeks of silent tension. This was not the first time Camilla had made the young princess profoundly uncomfortable. Weeks earlier, a private, poorly handled encounter had fundamentally changed their dynamic, and Charlotte had been carrying the weight of it in total silence ever since. The palace machinery could easily survive one uncomfortable sentence at a family lunch, but what Charlotte revealed to her mother behind that closed door transformed a fleeting family embarrassment into a deeply rooted emotional conflict that had been building for months. For Charlotte, the core argument was never really about a formal title. But for Camilla, the rejection of that specific title was exactly why the moment hurt so deeply and personally. Catherine sat beside her daughter, and rather than leading with strict discipline or royal protocol, gently asked what the word grandmother actually meant to her. The answer came slowly but clearly: trust, safety, shared stories, and someone who inherently makes you feel protected rather than pressured or managed. Charlotte had grown up surrounded by rigid royal titles where words like queen and heir heavily shaped both public duty and private identity. But to a child, intimate family language carries a vastly different, purely emotional weight. Catherine understood that crucial distinction immediately, and flatly refused to force her daughter to turn her genuine feelings into a polite performance for the sake of the adults. Meanwhile, in another room, Camilla was feeling the deep wound from a completely different, highly defensive angle, telling Charles that while she could tolerate hostile tabloid headlines and years of endless public comparison to Diana, she could not simply pretend that a direct rejection from his granddaughter meant nothing. The king desperately tried to reassure his wife, but he hesitated slightly before saying Charlotte would eventually come around, and that brief hesitation cut much deeper than he probably intended. Camilla had spent years desperately seeking genuine acceptance inside his complex family, and the younger generation represented a type of private, unconditional belonging that formal ceremonies and official titles simply could not guarantee. William eventually found Catherine and asked the heavy question both of them had been actively avoiding. Did Charlotte specifically mention Diana? Catherine confirmed that their daughter had indeed become increasingly curious about the grandmother she tragically never knew, especially after spending time looking at old photographs and hearing fond memories from her father. However, Catherine added something far more troubling. Charlotte was not rejecting Camilla simply because Diana had become idealized in her young mind. Rather, the girl described a specific exchange weeks earlier, where she felt Camilla had coldly dismissed something deeply emotionally important to her. William stopped outside Charlotte's bedroom door, his hand hovering over the handle before falling away, suddenly understanding that maintaining superficial royal harmony was no longer the primary issue. His young daughter had been unfairly pulled into a messy adult history she had absolutely no part in creating, and he realized he had to consciously decide whether to speak to her as a prince strictly protecting institutional order or as a father fiercely protecting his child's trust. When he finally entered the room, Charlotte explained that everything had fundamentally changed during a seemingly innocent palace gathering weeks before the disastrous Windsor lunch. There had been no loud argument, no dramatic walkout, and no formal confrontation. There was only a quiet room, a cherished photograph of Diana, and one single careless sentence from Camilla that Charlotte had silently carried away with her. The adults in the room had forgotten the brief exchange almost immediately, but Charlotte absolutely did not. What Camilla likely considered a harmless, practical correction settled very differently in the young princess's mind, because it directly touched the one vital relationship she could only ever know through inherited stories, suddenly making those precious stories feel as though they actively needed defending. Charlotte had spent several quiet afternoons with William, asking thoughtful questions about old family photographs and the people behind them. Conversations Catherine actively encouraged, because she desperately wanted all three of her children to understand their history as a genuine family, before they understood it as a rigid monarchy. During an informal family heritage presentation at Windsor, where personal objects from earlier generations were being discussed away from public ceremony, William kept his memories of Diana simple and deeply personal, describing her warmly as their grandmother without ever using the past as a weapon against anyone currently living. Charlotte had paused beside one specific photograph and quietly, affectionately called her Grandmother Diana. Camilla entered the room precisely during this exchange, heard the words, hesitated for a moment, and then told the young princess that she should not become too attached to people she never actually knew when she had a loving family currently around her. The sentence was delivered calmly, but its emotional effect was immediate and devastating. Charlotte looked down, quietly closed the small album she had been studying, and asked William if they could continue on another day. Signaling to him that something profound had just shifted later, the prince explicitly told Camilla that his daughter was old enough to perfectly understand tone, but far too young to carry the crushing weight of decades of unresolved family pain. The queen consort defensively insisted she had only wanted Charlotte to remain grounded in the present reality. But Catherine eventually learned of a second, more damaging moment that nobody else knew about. Charlotte had briefly left the room and returned quietly to retrieve a forgotten bracelet, and before entering fully, she overheard Camilla complaining to an aide that constant, lingering references to Diana could become confusing for the young children. The aide said very little, but Charlotte heard more than enough to understand the brutal underlying meaning, remembering her late grandmother was becoming an inconvenience that other people actively wanted managed and suppressed. Charlotte kept that deep hurt entirely to herself for weeks, never confronting Camilla, never demanding an apology, and never even telling William what she had overheard. Instead, reaching a silent private conclusion. She decided that if accepting one grandmother meant weakening the cherished memory in place of another, she would absolutely refuse the newer name completely. William listened intently as his daughter finally recounted the painful moment involving the forgotten bracelet, lowering his eyes and placing the family photograph he was holding face down on the desk. He realized the Windsor luncheon outburst had not been a moment of impulsive disobedience, but rather the culmination of a difficult decision Charlotte had been carrying in complete silence. By evening, the core issue was no longer whether Charlotte had behaved badly at lunch. William furiously wanted to know why a child had been placed in a position where fiercely defending a dead grandmother felt entirely necessary, and Camilla was about to hear that exact question directly from him. William did not summon diplomatic advisors, nor did he request a formal mediated family meeting. He simply asked Camilla to speak privately, waited until the heavy door closed securely, and firmly told her there would be absolutely no discussion regarding Charlotte's behavior until they addressed exactly what had caused it first. Camilla arrived fully expecting him to apply pressure to quickly repair the awkward luncheon dynamic. Instead, she found a fiercely protective father who believed his daughter had been unfairly forced to carry an emotional burden created entirely by adults, and he flatly refused to let royal hierarchy bury the issue. William deliberately kept Charles out of the room, knowing the monarch's presence would inevitably turn the deeply personal exchange into a formal question of rank and royal precedence, which was exactly what the prince wanted to avoid. This was not a debate about who officially outranked Charlotte. It was a fundamental boundary about who had the right to dictate her private emotional landscape. Camilla expected him to demand a formal apology for the public humiliation at Windsor, but instead he meticulously recounted the incident with the photograph, the forgotten bracelet, and the second overheard remark. William placed both palms firmly on the back of a chair but did not sit, towering slightly as Camilla remained seated, and asked the direct question she had been dreading. "Did you tell an aide that remembering her grandmother was confusing?" The Queen answered carefully, defensively stating that the comment was absolutely never intended for Charlotte's ears. But William's expression only hardened, sharply replying that intention does not erase impact. His voice remained tightly controlled until he explicitly explained the devastating result of her words. Charlotte now genuinely believed that accepting Camilla emotionally would mean actively betraying Diana's memory. Camilla's carefully maintained restraint finally cracked under the pressure. She tearfully told William that she had spent years being harshly judged against a woman who died long before the current family structure even took shape, admitting that every lingering memory of Diana made her feel as though there was absolutely no emotional space left for anyone else. She confessed she had reacted badly because she deeply feared that Charlotte's growing intense attachment to those stories would inevitably turn into yet another impossible comparison she could never hope to win. The prince listened to her confession, but he did not retreat from his position. His daughter, he stated firmly, was never asking Camilla to compete with a ghost. William then drew an absolute unyielding line in the sand. Nobody had forbidden Charlotte from caring for Camilla, and nobody would ever encourage hostility towards her, but absolutely no one would command the young girl to use an intimate family word she did not genuinely mean. Camilla asked nervously whether that was merely his personal opinion or a new official household rule, and his answer landed with brutal, undeniable simplicity. For his children, he and Catherine were the ultimate decision-makers. Camilla fell entirely silent, her defensive anger giving way to profound humiliation because she completely understood what that boundary meant. Charles may be the reigning king, but attempting to force his granddaughter to manufacture fake affection would make royal authority look incredibly cruel and weak rather than strong. Within the hour, Charles heard exactly what William had dictated and immediately asked to meet his eldest son completely alone. Camilla had desperately expected the king's ultimate authority to instantly restore order and enforce respect, but Charles now faced a choice that no crown or title could ever make easy. He had to either fiercely protect his wife's bruised dignity or formally recognize his son's absolute right to protect his daughter's emotional well-being. Charles had spent a lifetime existing inside a rigid system built entirely on titles, historical precedents, and unyielding obligation. Yet the deeply human crisis before him could not be resolved by relying on any of those tools. He could easily tell Charlotte exactly where to stand. He could determine precisely which ceremonies she attended, and he could establish exactly how members of the household formally addressed the Queen. But what he absolutely could not do without severe, lasting consequences was order his young granddaughter to genuinely feel a bond she did not feel. Charles met William alone, without aides or private secretaries taking notes, because he wanted absolutely no official record of any hesitations surrounding what had become an intensely personal, defining family decision. The king began the conversation by framing the dispute as a significant threat to overall family unity, not merely a challenge to Camilla's official rank, noting that royal protocol can easily control public conduct, but William made it crystal clear that Charlotte would flawlessly follow those rules whenever required. She would always be respectful and behave correctly in public, but the word grandmother, William insisted, belongs exclusively to private affection, not constitutional duty or forced performance. Charles painfully admitted that the refusal had wounded Camilla far more deeply than she had expressed publicly or privately, and while William did not dismiss that genuine pain, his answer was immediate and firm: Charlotte was wounded first. His daughter was entirely too young to fully understand decades of complex royal tension, and had absolutely no power when an adult carelessly made her feel that remembering Diana was somehow an act of disloyalty. The prince insisted that correcting Charlotte's feelings now would teach a terrible lesson, that the strongest, most powerful person in the room always gets to dictate everyone else's emotions. Charles felt the conflict tightening suffocatingly around him. He deeply loved his wife and intimately knew exactly how long and hard she had fought to feel genuinely secure inside the establishment. Yet, he also acutely knew that his young granddaughter would remember whatever happened next for the rest of her life. The monarch asked pointedly whether Catherine truly supported William's hardline position, and he answered with an unequivocal yes, confirming that together they had decided Charlotte would use Camilla's proper royal form of address when protocol strictly required it, but privately she would absolutely never be ordered to call her grandmother. Furthermore, George and Louis would be given the exact same freedom to let their relationships with Camilla develop entirely naturally, without forced expectations. Charles slowly removed his glasses, setting them carefully beside a closed folder as a heavy silence stretched endlessly between father and son, before finally stating that he would not compel Charlotte. The decision was delivered quietly, but its underlying meaning was absolutely enormous. The royal structure remained firmly under his sovereign authority, yet William and Catherine retained absolute control over their children's emotional upbringing, proving that even a sovereign cannot command trust without risking the very family bond he is desperately trying to protect. Charles optimistically believed the matter could still remain contained behind Windsor's closed doors, but that belief did not survive long. When Camilla learned he would not overrule William, something fundamental in her behavior shifted, and palace staff quickly began noticing her glaring absence from family gatherings she would normally never miss. The king had wisely chosen not to force Charlotte's affection. But the decision did not create immediate peace. It created a vast distance, and Camilla's defensive reaction would make that distance visible to everyone almost immediately. The very first consequence was not a passive-aggressive statement, but an empty chair. Camilla quietly withdrew from a private family tea where Charlotte was expected to attend, telling Charles she saw absolutely no purpose in creating another uncomfortable, tense encounter. What looked like polite restraint on the surface felt far more serious and damaging inside the family dynamic. Catherine worried Charlotte would inevitably blame herself. William suspected the withdrawal was a subtle form of emotional pressure, and Charles watched his wife actively retreat from the very people she had spent years desperately trying to join. Camilla continued to execute every single formal duty expected of her flawlessly, but private invitations became distinctly different. Household staff noticed that Charles consistently accepted family gatherings, while the Queen consort began conspicuously hesitating whenever she knew Charlotte would be present. These meetings were optional family occasions rather than official, mandated engagements, meaning attendance was personal, not required by royal duty, and that crucial difference meant every single absence now felt deliberate and pointed. Camilla told herself she was simply preventing another painful confrontation, yet the pattern actively created exactly what she had hoped to avoid, a highly visible, undeniable gap inside the family structure. Catherine saw the danger quickly when Charlotte immediately noticed the empty place at tea and anxiously asked whether Camilla had stayed away because of her. Her mother answered firmly and clearly that adults are entirely responsible for their own choices and their own feelings, and that Charlotte absolutely did not have to repair every single person around her simply because she spoke honestly. The young girl looked visibly relieved, but the relief did not last long. She nervously asked whether the Queen was angry, to which Catherine wisely replied that hurt and anger are not the exact same thing, an answer that left Charlotte quieter and more thoughtful than before. Camilla sat alone later that evening and tearfully told Charles she felt humiliatingly reduced to someone who must constantly ask whether his grandchildren are comfortable before even entering a room in her own home. The king listened, but this time he did not simply defend her pain. He told his wife directly that staying away would absolutely never make Charlotte trust her, and while withdrawal might protect Camilla from another painful moment, it unfairly placed the immense emotional weight back onto the child. For the very first time, Charles stated that the repair process must begin immediately, without ever expecting to hear the word grandmother. William soon heard that Camilla was actively considering skipping an upcoming highly important private birthday gathering as well, and his concern hardened instantly into resolve. If every absence followed Charlotte into another room, his daughter might begin falsely believing she possessed the power to control whether adults appeared or disappeared. That, he explicitly said to Catherine, was precisely the toxic emotional burden they had desperately wanted to prevent from the start. She completely agreed, but she also noticed something unexpected in Charlotte's behavior. The young girl was clearly not pleased that Camilla was gone. Camilla returned briefly after the tea had officially ended and stopped beside the completely untouched place setting prepared for her, resting one hand on the back of the chair but never sitting down. The empty seat suddenly felt significantly less like protection and far more like complete surrender. Charlotte had refused a specific word, not the entire person. And once William truly understood that vital distinction, he actively encouraged one private conversation that would fundamentally change the direction of the entire conflict. No king sat between them to mediate. No future king spoke for either side. Catherine waited patiently elsewhere. Charles was deliberately absent. And for the very first time since the crisis began, Charlotte and Camilla faced one another entirely, without the oppressive machinery of the monarchy surrounding the conversation. The young princess had absolutely not changed her mind about the specific word that started everything, and Camilla knew that what changed instead was far more difficult, as both finally explained exactly what they genuinely believed the other had taken from them. Catherine only helped arrange the meeting after Charlotte explicitly stated she wanted it, and William agreed on one strict condition: nobody would use the conversation to demand an apology or force a new name. Charles told Camilla the exact same thing before she entered the room, emphasizing that true reconciliation must begin completely without conditions, because a royal title is a formal style used in public duty, while a family name carries private emotion, and for once, those two worlds were being kept strictly apart. Charlotte brought the exact same photograph of Diana that had been at the center of the earlier hurt, placed it gently on the table, and told Camilla she honestly thought the Queen wanted her to completely stop caring about someone deeply important to her father. The words were incredibly simple, but they landed with immense emotional weight. Camilla did not interrupt, instead bravely admitting that the photograph had touched a deep insecurity she should absolutely never have placed on a child. Hearing Diana discussed, she confessed, could make her feel as if she would always be unfairly compared with a perfect memory she could never possibly compete against. Charlotte answered without a trace of anger, stating simply that she was never asking Camilla to compete, a sentence that completely disarmed the older woman. For years, the Queen had carried an adult fear into every single mention of Diana, but the young princess had genuinely only been asking innocent questions about her own family history. Camilla finally saw exactly how much heavy adult history had been unfairly pushed onto a child who never asked to inherit it, and she apologized directly, stating she was entirely wrong to suggest Charlotte could become too attached to someone she never knew, and wrong again to describe those precious memories as confusing. She did not ask for the word grandmother, an omission that mattered enormously, and Charlotte gracefully accepted the apology but clearly stated she still wanted to call her Camilla in private when appropriate and use her proper title at official moments, to which the Queen readily agreed. As Charlotte reached the door to leave, she stopped, turned back, and asked whether Camilla would come to the upcoming family birthday gathering after all, marking the first time the invitation was genuinely personal rather than merely ceremonial. Camilla was caught completely off guard, but she sincerely said yes. They had finally found a fragile, private peace, but the wider public knew absolutely nothing about the conversation. And when Charlotte and Camilla appeared together days later, a single, highly scrutinized gesture became the image everyone desperately wanted to interpret. The public did not hear Charlotte's private, healing conversation with Camilla. It only saw something much smaller, and in many ways, far more powerful when cameras outside Windsor captured the young princess stepping from a family gathering, pausing beside the Queen, and offering her hand rather than the familiar, expected embrace observers wanted to see. Within hours, the striking image completely dominated news broadcasts and front pages. To outsiders, it looked like a cold rejection, but inside the family, the respectful gesture meant almost the exact opposite. William knew every single movement would be intensely examined before the family even arrived. And Catherine knew it too, as rumors had already started circulating wildly around Windsor and photographers were desperately waiting for any sign that the private tension was real. This gathering carried a heavy second burden. People were no longer watching only for duty. They were watching Charlotte, yet her parents firmly refused to stage fake affection, giving her only one instruction: be respectful and be yourself. Camilla felt the immense pressure the moment the images began spreading globally. One prominent front page ran the photograph of Charlotte extending her hand beneath the bold words, "The Royal Distance," while television panels endlessly replayed the brief exchange, treating the missing embrace as definitive evidence that the family rupture had deepened significantly. Near Windsor Castle, a crowd watched the royal cars depart, with some actively applauding the young princess for fiercely standing her ground, while others argued passionately that no child should ever become the center of a messy adult conflict, turning one private boundary into a massive national argument within hours. Charles painfully admitted that the refusal had wounded Camilla far more deeply than she had expressed publicly or privately, and while William did not dismiss that genuine pain, his answer was immediate and firm: Charlotte was wounded first. His daughter was entirely too young to fully understand decades of complex royal tension, and had absolutely no power when an adult carelessly made her feel that remembering Diana was somehow an act of disloyalty. The prince insisted that correcting Charlotte's feelings now would teach a terrible lesson: that the strongest, most powerful person in the room always gets to dictate everyone else's emotions. Charles felt the conflict tightening suffocatingly around him. He deeply loved his wife and intimately knew exactly how long and hard she had fought to feel genuinely secure inside the establishment. Yet, he also acutely knew that his young granddaughter would remember whatever happened next for the rest of her life. The monarch asked pointedly whether Catherine truly supported William's hardline position, and he answered with an unequivocal yes, confirming that together they had decided Charlotte would use Camilla's proper royal form of address when protocol strictly required it, but privately she would absolutely never be ordered to call her grandmother. Furthermore, George and Louis would be given the exact same freedom to let their relationships with Camilla develop entirely naturally, without forced expectations. Charles slowly removed his glasses, setting them carefully beside a closed folder as a heavy silence stretched endlessly between father and son, before finally stating that he would not compel Charlotte. Charles painfully admitted that the refusal had wounded Camilla far more deeply than she had expressed publicly or privately, and while William did not dismiss that genuine pain, his answer was immediate and firm: Charlotte was wounded first. His daughter was entirely too young to fully understand decades of complex royal tension, and had absolutely no power when an adult carelessly made her feel that remembering Diana was somehow an act of disloyalty. The prince insisted that correcting Charlotte's feelings now would teach a terrible lesson: that the strongest, most powerful person in the room always gets to dictate everyone else's emotions. Charles felt the conflict tightening suffocatingly around him. He deeply loved his wife and intimately knew exactly how long and hard she had fought to feel genuinely secure inside the establishment. Yet, he also acutely knew that his young granddaughter would remember whatever happened next for the rest of her life. The monarch asked pointedly whether Catherine truly supported William's hardline position, and he answered with an unequivocal yes, confirming that together they had decided Charlotte would use Camilla's proper royal form of address when protocol strictly required it, but privately she would absolutely never be ordered to call her grandmother. Furthermore, George and Louis would be given the exact same freedom to let their relationships with Camilla develop entirely naturally, without forced expectations. Charles slowly removed his glasses, setting them carefully beside a closed folder as a heavy silence stretched endlessly between father and son, before finally stating that he would not compel Charlotte. Charles painfully admitted that the refusal had wounded Camilla far more deeply than she had expressed publicly or privately, and while William did not dismiss that genuine pain, his answer was immediate and firm: Charlotte was wounded first. His daughter was entirely too young to fully understand decades of complex royal tension, and had absolutely no power when an adult carelessly made her feel that remembering Diana was somehow an act of disloyalty. The prince insisted that correcting Charlotte's feelings now would teach a terrible lesson, that the strongest, most powerful person in the room always gets to dictate everyone else's emotions. Charles felt the conflict tightening suffocatingly around him. He deeply loved his wife and intimately knew exactly how long and hard she had fought to feel genuinely secure inside the establishment. Yet, he also acutely knew that his young granddaughter would remember whatever happened next for the rest of her life. The monarch asked pointedly whether Catherine truly supported William's hardline position, and he answered with an unequivocal yes, confirming that together they had decided Charlotte would use Camilla's proper royal form of address when protocol strictly required it, but privately she would absolutely never be ordered to call her grandmother. Furthermore, George and Louis would be given the exact same freedom to let their relationships with Camilla develop entirely naturally, without forced expectations. Charles slowly removed his glasses, setting them carefully beside a closed folder as a heavy silence stretched endlessly between father and son, before finally stating that he would not compel Charlotte.